Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here for the launch of Green Alliance's most recent report on reforming transport taxes. This is actually the first in a series of 2 reports that we have developed to explore how and why the system for applying taxes to various different modes of transport in the UK is not necessarily very well aligned to what a future transport system might look like as we move towards net zero. We're joined today by some brilliant colleagues of mine from Green Alliance and from WPI Economics, who we've been working with on this, who have conducted the research, and they're going to be here today to introduce the reports, answer questions that you might have. So please do drop questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. You can also turn on closed captions if you'd like by clicking the little CC button at the bottom of your screen. So joining us today, we have Stuart Dossett, who is a senior policy advisor with us at Green Alliance, and Sophie O'Connell, who is a policy advisor, Zoe Avison, a policy analyst, both at Green Alliance. And we also have James Edgar, who is the chief economist at WPI Economics, and they have been helping conduct the detailed analysis for the second part of our work in this space. To kick us off, I'm going to hand over to Stuart to just give a little bit of context and outline of the reason for us wanting to do this work. Stuart, over to you.
Great, thanks, Helena, and welcome all. So as Helena mentioned, the report we've launched today is going to be the first of 2 reports that Green Alliance are publishing this year, examining the links between transport taxation and net zero. So in this report, which Sophie will take you through shortly, we set out the case for why transport tax reform is needed, why transport taxes need to be considered together, and why the work needs to start now. Then looking ahead to 2035, we show how decarbonisation will be impacting on tax revenue from transport and where transport needs further impetus to complete its path towards full decarbonisation. In the second report, which we'll be publishing in March, we'll present a menu of options for transport tax, considering the net zero transition, answering some of the challenges that we'll set out today. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Sophie.
Sorry there, I couldn't unmute myself. Hi all, thanks for joining. I'm going to take us through an overview of our report now. So hopefully you can see the slides moving along. I'm going to start off by talking about the transport tax system today. So in the year 2019-2020, transport raised £44 billion to the exchequer, which is the equivalent of 8% of the overall tax revenue that year. Transport has negative impacts on society, such as raising greenhouse gas emissions, producing air pollution and road congestion. But tax can be applied as a tool to tackle these problems. It can create market pressure for solutions, a stable source of revenue to be redistributed elsewhere in society, and it can drive behaviour change. But transport taxes have been developed in a piecemeal way over time and therefore lack consistency across modes. This graphic here that you can see represents the current transport tax system. At the moment, most revenue is raised from cars, vans and HGVs through fuel duty, which raises £28 billion per year, a further £7 billion from vehicle exercise duty and £5.5 billion from VAT on fuel duty. Yet fuel duty and VAT on fuel duty are already being eroded with the shift to electric vehicles. As well as that, fuel duty revenue has actually fallen in real terms in recent years because its rate has been frozen for over a decade, rather than increasing in line with inflation, like public transport fares largely have done. And there are also taxes raising some lower revenues on here, such as air passenger duty and the HGV levy. Now onto the case for change. So the transport tax system is not paying its fair share for the emissions it produces at the moment. The taxes applied to each transport mode don't necessarily reflect the greenhouse gas emissions generated, such as there's little to no tax being raised from aviation and shipping, despite them contributing 32% of the UK's transport greenhouse gas emissions. The UK government doesn't levy directly on environmental taxes, but there are some indirect taxes on environmentally damaging activities such as fuel duty and air passenger duty. And with the race to meet net zero by 2050, the transport system is rapidly changing. So with changes such as the electric vehicle transition, revenues are being significantly impacted. But also later on, the aviation and shipping are actually transitioning at a lower pace than cars, vans and HGVs. So reform for the transport tax system can do two things. Firstly, it can replace the lost revenue from the EV transition. And secondly, it can help to create a cleaner and fairer system by using tax where it's appropriate to drive the decarbonisation of aviation and shipping. And now the government has the opportunity to set out a vision for transport taxes that can help build a fairer and cleaner future while protecting its long-term revenue base. So on to defining transport taxes for the future, we really need to consider the broader environmental picture as well as social and equity factors alongside the decarbonisation of transport. So particularly on the equity point, applying or increasing taxes on transport modes can pass the cost on to consumers regardless of their actual ability to pay or their proportional contribution to emissions. So taxes really need to be designed with this in mind. And this is best demonstrated by looking at the travel habits of wealthier people who tend to drive and fly more than those on lower incomes. This is quite starkly demonstrated by 75% of flights in the UK and from the UK being taken by just 20% of the population. So applying a blanket tax across all flights wouldn't necessarily tackle this disproportionality of who flies the most, and it could impact those who rarely fly from doing so. So obviously applying taxes on environmentally damaging behaviours is a really positive thing at face value, but wealthier households are better financially equipped to go through with the switch to zero carbon alternatives such as electric vehicles, which then have lower running costs in the long term. And in this scenario, it would leave poorer households left driving the most polluting vehicles, therefore facing the brunt of the actual tax burden. So taxes can be designed to mitigate these impacts and help create a fairer system. I'm now going to talk through a 2035 scenario. So the government is hoping to decarbonise the transport sector by 2050. So by 2035, we're going to be well on our way to achieving that. And I'm going to discuss this through some of the main transport modes. So firstly, we're going to start with road transport, which is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions within the transport sector, with cars and vans generating half of the sector's emissions. But aside from emissions, there are also other negative impacts like air and plastic pollution and congestion. And actually, over 3/4 of driving's true cost to society arise from congestion through creating a lack of economic productivity. So as you can see in the graphic, by 2035, most cars on the road will be electric. All sales of cars will be zero emission at the tailpipe, which will reduce both emissions but also fuel duty quite significantly, leaving a potential hole in the public finances of £28 billion per year. And although air pollution will reduce with the move to electric vehicles, there'll still be some pollution from brake and tyre wear, which obviously is not ideal for the environment. As well as this, without efforts to drive demand down for private car use, congestion is likely to remain or worsen in the future. So the tax system should be applied to try to tackle this. Now onto HGVs, where their progress is slightly lagging behind that of cars and vans in the image on the left-hand side. You'll still be able to buy the more emitting HGVs up until 2040, so 5 years on from this scenario now, but there will be more entering the market. So as you can see, 1/3 of HGVs will be zero emission by 2035. But as with fuel duty, the HGV levy is applied on those vehicles that are most polluting. So with the transition of them becoming cleaner vehicles, this levy will be eroded. And now on to the modes that are more tricky to decarbonise, aviation and shipping. As I've said, there's no correlation between the different transport modes and the amount of emissions they produce and the revenue they raise. And this is most clearly by looking at aviation. which is responsible for a quarter of all transport's emissions in the UK. Yeah, it's not subject to fuel duty, it has a 0 rating of VAT, and there are free allowances given in the emissions trading scheme. So effectively, aviation gets a £7 billion tax break each year, which obviously undermines the polluter pays principle that other modes loosely abide by. And importantly, the path to decarbonise here was set out in the Jet Zero strategy last year by the government. But in that strategy, it allows for a 74% increase in passenger numbers by 2050, which is in stark contrast with that of the CCC, which suggests there'd be a 25% increase in passenger numbers. This increase in passenger demand is largely offset by the Jet Zero strategy, placing a lot of its bets on decarbonisation through technological advancements, such as zero-emission aircraft. But the timelines for when these aircraft would be used at commercial scale are uncertain, and certainly not in the near term. So in the interim, sustainable aviation fuels will be put into the fuel mix to reduce the amount of fossil fuels used when flying. So by 2030, there's a 10% target of 10% of the fuel being made up of sustainable aviation fuels. Taxes can also be applied here to drive down demand through something such as a frequent flyer levy, which would increase the tax on an individual the more they fly in a given year. And this would help to relieve the risk and the pressure on those technological solutions being the answer to decarbonise the sector. And looking at shipping, it's a bit more of a muddled picture here. The solutions to decarbonise are slightly more unclear, but it's likely that sustainable fuels are going to be the favoured option, yet they also have some potential negative environmental impacts and risks surrounding them. But also in 2035, shipping is likely to be included in the emissions trading scheme. So hopefully those slides have shown that by 2035, we're going to be well on our way to achieving a net zero world, and the changes to do that will have quite significant impacts on the public finances. So making changes to the tax system will take a long time to consult, communicate and implement with the public. And it's really important that the government start having this discussion imminently, because if we don't, then they could risk locking in this declining tax revenue base, which would obviously have severe consequences for society. So not only is there an economic argument for transport tax reform, there's also a political one as well. Green Alliance's research from last year found that a greener tax system is supported by 6 out of 10 people backing environmentally damaging behaviours being more expensive than those that are not, with only 12% opposing that idea. And there was also in this research support found for a driver charging system if that was to be coupled with investment in public transport infrastructure. So politically, it makes sense for reform. And on to what we're calling for in this report. As Stuart set out, this report is looking at the problems with the current transport tax system, and our second report will look deeper into the possible solutions to that to maintain the revenue base and to shape a more sustainable future. But here we're really calling for the government to firstly start a conversation with the public and be realistic about the need for transport tax reform. Secondly, to develop some possible policy options there for public discussion around reform and what needs to be updated. Thirdly, to create an independent commission to evaluate the options and to consider how they would work in practice. And then lastly, to ensure that these policy options fit in line with the transition to net zero. And I think now I'll pass back to Helena. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sophie. I hope that gives everybody good context about the content of the report that we'll get into more discussion about. I'm going to hand over to our colleague Zoe now, who's going to comment on how transport tax reform needs to fit within a broader green tax roadmap.
Cheers, Helena. And yeah, I think this speaks to something that we've noted about the tax system in general and how the whole system needs a rethink when it comes to the environment. So the UK tax system is huge, it's hulking, it's super complicated, and lots of experts think it needs reforming in lots of different ways. reformers have their sights on things like land, property, income, wealth, all sorts of things. But there's one way in which it's really rapidly becoming out of date, and that's how it's designed around quite a high carbon economy. And if you're thinking long term, and not even that long term now, as Sophie said, 2035 we will be well on our way, hopefully, to decarbonising the transport system. We need to have some more long-term thinking about how tax fits and works with that. So we've called for the government to publish a roadmap for the tax system to show how it will evolve, develop and support the net zero transition. And so there's a few reasons why roadmap is a good place to start. So one reason, we've got a huge amount of revenue reliant on the sale of fossil fuels. And the Office for Budget Responsibility now terms as a fiscal risk, and there's no word from the government for their plans for how they're going to deal with that, whether they'll be replacing that revenue with other taxes or doing something else. And it's a big chunk, and a large part of that is from fuel duty, so it's from the transport system. And in total, receipts equivalent to about 1.6% of GDP. Today's GDP could be lost by 2050 because of decarbonisation. And the longer we wait, the worse that problem gets. And as Sophie said, these tax changes will take time to develop and implement and consult. So having a think about what we're going to do about it now and planning for the future, which we know is coming, seems wise. And then there's also a wider point about how the tax system invests people's appetite for investment, whether that's private businesses or even households. The tax system obviously affects how people will spend their money. So if one of the instances we look at is taxes on electricity. And if those are removed and electricity becomes cheaper, does that then make the investment case for heat pumps or for electric steel making equipment more appealing? And so signalling tax changes in advance can stimulate an early investment in technologies to switch away from fossil fuels. And that's private investment, and that makes the whole cost of the transition less. And it also, the point about signalling ahead with a roadmap is really important. So if you think about what the tax system is actually for, by and large, it is about raising revenue, and that is its primary purpose. But there are other reasons that we use taxes, and they can be to affect behaviour change. And the government has previously said they don't want to do a roadmap because they don't want to risk forestalling activity, which is basically when someone knows a tax is coming up, changes their behaviour ahead of time so that they can avoid the tax. But actually, when you're decarbonising a system, early activity, early changes, early behaviour change is really what you want to get. The sooner we do that, the more chance we have of staying within our carbon budgets. And there's good examples as well. So from other parts of society, the sugar tax is a great example of a tax that was used to change behaviour. HMT, they forecast raising 520 million from the sugar tax, and actually when it was implemented they only raised 336 million, and that's because businesses knew the tax was coming, so they reformulated their products ahead of time so that they wouldn't be subject to the tax. And that's what we want to see with across the economy with taxes and low carbon technologies. If people can be given the confidence to invest ahead of time, it smooths the transition significantly. And there's also another point about policy making and how to make policy better, basically. And there's a little bit goes to sort of the architecture of Westminster, of Whitehall, where tax making powers sit within Treasury, but other policy powers sit within the other departments. And what you actually really want is for example, BEIS or DEFRA to be able to use their policies in conjunction with a tax change to have the maximum impact. And we've done modelling to show how that works, where two different changes happening at the same time can have a greater impact than by themselves. And bringing departments together to talk about how these changes are phased, will just help to make the whole policy package more coherent. Basically, at the moment we even have parts of the tax system that disincentivize people from making sustainable choices. So sorting those out and planning ahead and joining people up, policymakers up, so that we've got all parts of the policymaking landscape pulling in the same direction, are all reasons that we need to start thinking long term and making plans for long term for our tax system. And there's a few good examples of where it's happening, just piecemeal. The government removed VAT from things like insulation and heat pumps recently. And they did it for a 5-year period, which is great. Longer term changes like this allow people to sort of, get used to the idea and invest. But there's also examples of where the tax system isn't being used well for the environment. So fuel duty is a big one. It's been frozen and even cut most recently, despite having negligible impact on the price rises we saw recently. So there's bringing these together would help to sort of prevent kind of knee-jerk reactions that we see in the tax system being used in quite an ad hoc way, an incoherent way, and sort of bring it all together in a better way. I'll just pass back to Helena now, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. Really, really interesting. And I'm sure lots of people on this call will, on this webinar, will be backing the call for government to work more cross-departmental and think longer term about all this stuff. If you've read the report and if you're working in this space, I'm sure you know aviation is another really good example of where tax incentives are in the opposite direction of where we want them to be from a carbon and emissions point of view. Great. I'm going to hand over to James from WPI, who's just going to give us a taste of some of the modelling that's happening for the second part of this report. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Helena, and thank you for the opportunity to present here. So as Helena said, I'm just going to give you a flavour of the modelling that we're undertaking. I should just share the slides here for the second phase of the report. So I'm James Edgar, Chief Economist at WPI Economics, a public policy and economics consultancy focused on projects and work which improves public policy. And we've been commissioned to look at modelling of identifying and modelling potential reform options in this space. So just a few slides on this. So we start with two key questions. There's many questions which come up here, but when you're looking at decarbonisation and tax broadly, two key questions. How can we incentivise decarbonisation most effectively and efficiently, which leads to environmental taxation as a possible tool and the incentives that Sophie and Zoe have just been talking about. But then also, how does that process of decarbonisation affect transport tax collection and what are the implications? So, of course, what amount of tax revenue is raised and how is that affected? And then broader social impacts. I've seen in the Q&A some discussion of particularly in road transport and the impact of taxation on congestion and other issues, which I'll say more about in a moment. And then critically, in terms of framing thinking of reform options, it's really important to think about the link between tax purpose and design. So good revenue raising taxes, we need to raise revenue from the places in the economy that are best. And what does that mean? What does best typically mean when you think of it from that perspective? Well, we need to bring in stable amounts, fiscal sustainability, they're easy to collect, hard to avoid, minimizing distortions that you don't want, and are easy to comply with. And that's the sort of things which drive good revenue raising taxes. But then, as has been set out, there's also a set of taxation options which can be aimed at reducing social costs, such as pollution. And the primary aim of environmental taxes is to alter behaviour, and therefore are actually likely to show a decreasing tax take. So there's a tension between these two goals. So you need to know what your tax is for and design it to that purpose. Some taxes merge the two. So I'll say a word more about fuel duty in a moment. Fuel duty is an excellent revenue raising tax, and it helps to reduce congestion and pollution as well. So you can sometimes achieve both, and fuel duty is a very good example of that. And then finally, in terms of principles, when you're thinking about this, remember that not every tax needs to meet all goals. It's the overall impact of the whole system that matters. So you don't need every single tax to be driving in the same direction. It's what are the incentives overall for decarbonisation in this context. So a quick example of road transport and fuel duty, because it brings these principles to light really well. So as I said, it's been a very good revenue raising tax. It's extremely easy to collect and cheap to collect, and it has positive social impacts as well. But as most people on this call be well aware, no fuel duty for electric vehicles means a declining revenue forecast. This is a graph from RAC Foundation of some modelling that they've done looking at the likely path for this as the car fleet decarbonises. But the other impacts of this is, of course, the purchase and the driving of electric cars is strongly incentivized. So the purchase, good, we're getting more electric cars on the road. Driving, not so good. You've got two problems here. You've got a loss of a tax that has good revenue raising characteristics and an increase in congestion. So when we then take the two thoughts of raising revenue and reducing environmental damage, if you look at the raising revenue side, the Treasury have the issue of this good tax that's declining. Do we need to replace this? Is it sensible to replace this? So you could do that through a flat rate per mile charge for electric vehicles, which raises revenue effectively and also helps to reduce congestion. It's not perfectly targeted, but it reduces congestion. Whereas if you look at it from the point of view of reducing environmental damage, we want to incentivize uptake of lower emission vehicles. So you could vary a charge based on emissions, which would incentivize that purchase and the use of zero emission vehicles compared to other cars. Which of course, if you're still incentivizing the use, you're still getting increased congestion through that method. So one way to just incentivize the purchase of low and zero emission vehicles compared to petrol and diesel vehicles is have an emissions-based purchase tax. We already have a version which is vehicle excise duty that varies when you purchase, but you could strengthen those incentives even further. And then you could just simply increase fuel duty, incentivizing lower use of petrol and diesel cars, more use of other transport options as well. So you look at it from two different perspectives, and that's what we're trying to bring together. And finally, in this space, really critical to consider the second-hand market, because you've got to consider tax reform in the context of other regulation. And of course, there's a ban on new petrol and diesel sales from 2030. It's driving substantial change, but what happens in the second-hand market? So critical to think about. So just want to give you a flavour of how we're thinking. We're doing the modelling for the second report in this series, and the questions we're looking at there. What proportion of overall taxation comes from transport, including some areas that are harder to grasp, like VAT on purchase of vehicles? How's that likely to change? Where is taxation an appropriate mix, part of the mix of measures? So looking at that broader context of regulation, of emissions trading schemes, and other measures. Identify reform options and modelling their impacts. What tax take might you get from these? What's the behavioural response through elasticity-based modelling? And that leads to, well, what is the estimated impact on emissions from different tax reform options? And the importance of estimating distributional impacts where we can through national travel survey data and other data, to the importance of a just transition. There's many options which might seem appealing, but then you find the impacts are going to fall more heavily on low income groups. How can you identify that, mitigate that while still achieving environmental goals? And then finally, that point of the system as a whole. What does V-packages look like as a whole when you combine sensible, where there are reforms which fit sensibly together? So that's just a very quick flavour of what we're up to, and I'll hand back to Helena for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, James. Hopefully that has given everyone a bit of excitement about what is going to come in the next part of the report, the more kind of solution side of things in a short while. A question from me, first of all. Stuart, we'll come to you. Is the simple solution to all of this to not just to apply a carbon tax across all sectors and all modes of transport? What's the kind of pros and cons of that kind of approach?
Yeah, so a simple uniform carbon tax across the economy, I guess, has the benefit of being somewhat simple in that 1 unit of carbon is priced the same no matter where it is emitted throughout the economy. But we live in a world that's slightly more complicated than that, unfortunately, and actually from carbon emissions are not the only thing that we care about when designing a tax system. So ensuring that the tax level from any given activity is set in such a way that reflects both the sort of desirability of that activity or the indesirability of that activity in the round, not just through the emissions perspective, probably leads you towards a situation where a single carbon price across the economy is not the most sensible outcome, but is definitely a useful benchmark by which to assess what the overall tax level should be.
Thanks, Stuart. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to come in on that. James, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, one addition on that is measurement. It would be lovely as an economist who wants to have a single carbon tax. How do you measure emissions perfectly in all different circumstances? And that's a key issue to the design of any tax as well. You can only tax what you can measure, and that often turns into particular market transactions, purchase of vehicles, of fuel, etc. And yeah, so the theory is good, but it's how do you then actually turn that into practical real taxes, which you can implement.
Thanks, James. Zoe, is it actually in the Treasury's interest to use the tax system in order to reach net zero, when at the moment we're talking a lot about revenue, when they're revenue raising from tax, and successive governments have said no, we don't want to raise tax, and then we get in a situation where they do want to introduce new taxes? Is there something long-term? What's the kind of long-term solution that we need to incentivize net zero and investment in these low carbon tech solutions? What should Treasury be doing and other departments be doing?
Yeah, I think this is the issue with not having a long-term vision for the tax system, is that you can realize that you've got a singular tax problem for a decarbonisation issue, and then have to prepare lots of materials, and it takes a long time, and at the same time the wider public buy-in is less because you haven't explained the overarching vision. So we've done some research on what people think about greening the tax system. I think Sophie mentioned a few stats from it earlier. But in general, people were in favour of a tax system that was changing to reflect environmental priorities. People do really care about climate change and the environment, first of all. But they wanted to see tax as part of a wider vision, and also wanted, explanation for why it was needed, and whether it's going to be effective, and reassurances about things like fairness and transparency. But with those caveats, people are up for the idea, and I think the government, looking at its longer term vision, explaining its working and its sort of reasoning, helps to have that buy-in, and it sort of gives itself a bit more cover, I guess, for making these changes, instead of sort of bit by bit tweaking here and there, and people thinking, how does this fit with another part of the system which isn't working for the environment.
Thank you. James, you used to work in the civil service. Have you got any kind of thoughts and reflections on how kind of things that Zoe's talking about and we've talked about in the report could actually play out in reality?
Yeah, so those who don't know, I used to work in Department of Transport itself for the first 10 years of my career. It's interesting as we're working on this work, it's there's some tension between the Treasury and the departments is indicative in the work that we're doing. And I think that's why we're trying to approach it from this perspective of the Treasury's focus of raising revenue. What does that mean? How is that thought about? Where is it sensible and best to raise revenue? And then the department's perspective on how can we best tackle social, the various societal challenges. And it really goes a lot of this moment. You can start talking about broad machinery of government changes, how should the departments work together, all of that. A lot of the time it does come back to commitment at the top drives this. That's part of the nature of it. So of any structure you have, because you still have those incentives, even if you somehow change the machinery of government, you still have the different needs of the government society as a whole. So I think that's the biggest thought is don't get too obsessed with difficult machinery of government changes. It's commitment at the top, public acceptance, those big things which really matter.
Thanks, always useful to have that insider insight. There's a question here for Sophie. Sophie rightly noted that the wealthy travel more, especially when it comes to flying. But on the flip side of the coin, deprived social groups are most affected by the air pollution and danger on the road created by more privileged groups. Is that being considered?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I think it's definitely something to be considered when we've looked at this. We're not just looking at the issue with fuel duty being reduced and therefore looking at a road charger scheme or road pricing. There are other areas in transport that need to be considered, like aviation. But of course, there's always kind of one group that are more affected, and here it's those that are from more deprived communities that are more exposed to air pollution. That's really stark, particularly in London. The more deprived boroughs have much higher levels of air pollution, and even on a more granular level, kind of looking street by street. So it's something that definitely needs to be considered, which is going back to the question that Stuart answered on the carbon pricing. There's more to be considered than just pricing for carbon. We need to look at the social and health impacts of that. But the whole point of this report is not to just focus on road transport, it's to look at kind of the system holistically, and particularly the stats around the wealthier proportion of the population that fly more. If we're looking on kind of emissions generated on an individual level, that really needs to be something that's addressed through the tax system. We can't allow for people to be having, 5 flights a year. It's such a environmentally damaging behaviour to have, and that impacts everyone, not even just in the UK. If we're looking at global climate change as an international issue, it generally impacts those in more deprived communities. So yeah, it's definitely something to be considered through the tax system.
Thanks, Sophie. We've had quite a few questions in the chat on the kind of road pricing question. And this isn't, as Sophie's just said, a session about road pricing, but I know that lots of people have a lot of opinions about it. We've talked about this internally quite a lot at Green Alliance before. Stuart and I have discussed it loads, so I'm going to invoke chair rights and pass on all the tricky questions to Stuart. I'll do a couple in one. One from Sam asking, it's assumed that fuel duty revenue is going to be replaced by different road taxes, but that hasn't really come in yet. And at the moment, we're seeing this kind of scattered patchwork approach through congestion charges and ULEZ zones right across the country. And Sam's question is, shouldn't we just focus on efficiency, i.e. reducing congestion and emissions, and accept less revenue from road taxes? And on the kind of flip side to that, a question from Lisa, who is quoting some research that we actually published about 18 months ago on the need to reduce the amount of car miles driven, that should we be only thinking about revenue neutral road pricing, or should we be thinking about how we can use it as a tool to reduce the amount that people are driving? So 2 really difficult questions for you, Stuart, there. Enjoy.
Thank you for those, but both really important questions. I think partly the scattered approach and taking this question first, where we're seeing pockets of clean air zones or congestion charging popping up at a local level, is somewhat reflective of the fact that the government, central government, hasn't really engaged fully with the fact that fuel duty is just one mechanism by which to mitigate some of transport's other issues, but also that I'm not sure they've fully appreciated yet just how quickly that potential fuel duty revenue is going to disappear. And so we've got a bit of a scattered approach developing at the local level, and it also speaks to the work that Zoe talked through, where we're calling for this green tax roadmap to think more holistically around this. I guess focusing on congestion and efficiency wouldn't necessarily mean a lower tax revenue from the road transport system. So I would challenge the premise there slightly. Coming to Lisa's question here, can you just trying to find it in the chat. I'm not sure if it's moved into the answered, but could you just quickly remind me of it, Helena?
Yes, I think we might have moved it. It's just asking how or should we be using road pricing rather than as a revenue neutral replacement for fuel duty as a tool to reduce the amount that people are driving.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. So James will be able to talk about this more than I, and somewhat throwing it towards him. But one of the things that we've been conscious to do with this work is because we want to look across the transport system as a whole rather than maintaining the kind of siloed individual mode by mode approach, is we're not going to constrain the tax revenue from road to be the same in the future as it is today. We're looking more across the transport modes holistically. And one of the things that we will be considering is whether, for instance, the tax take that comes from the road should increase within that as a percentage of that, or whether it should decrease, and assessing these things in the round. So we're not coming at it from a position of revenue neutrality from the road system. We'll be looking at what the appropriate tax take should be to achieve the outcomes that we think are desirable. James, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, probably not too much. To just echo that point. There's nothing special about the amount that fuel duty has collected from a raising revenue perspective. If there was a change, if there was a change in conditions and you let it reduce, that is perhaps correct. And from that point of view so you can model differences, but then as Stuart says, the key thing is where are you reducing congestion and how, and what part does it play in covering that key societal cost? That's what the main societal cost is. Yeah, and within that, the level you set it at needs to depend on your underneath that modelling of what proportion of travel do you think needs to be by other modes, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty in the CCC's modelling there about what there's different scenarios. So I think it's important to remain have an assessment of, or what does it require under different types of scenarios, which we may be able to only do part of in this work, but that's something that we should then build towards as well. The CCC and government should also be looking at that question.
Thanks, James. There's a question in the chat that the answer feels very obvious and short, and it's a one-word answer, yes. But I'd like to ask Zoe to dive into it a little bit further based on her work in other areas of tax. And the question is, presumably it would be best for regional and local governments to also have similar long-term roadmaps for tax. Zoe, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on any kind of other areas that you've worked on where this has worked well or needs much more work, including in transport.
I suppose it depends where the effective, if we're talking about the environmentally effective tax powers lie. A lot of these are set at a national level, but some taxes are set locally, and where local authorities sort of have that control and think about how that works with their other policies, I think it makes sense for them to think about the coherence of their total package and a longer term vision. We tend to have fewer tax is raised at a local level here than in most other countries. It's quite a low percentage of overall tax take. But there are calls to change that and devolve more tax raising powers, and therefore it will become more important. There are things sort of like clean air zones and the ULEZ and things like that. So thinking about those in long term and giving people sight of what's coming up would be useful. Yeah.
Thanks, Zoe. There's a question here on VAT charging for electric vehicles domestically versus public. I don't think that's something we're diving into the second report on specifically, but we have talked about it before. Sophie, I don't know if you just want to say a little bit about the charging VAT question.
Yeah, sure. So currently at the moment, if you charge directly from your home, you're charged at 5% of a VAT rate, but if you're using a public charger, then it's 20% because of the domestic rules around domestic charging on power. So obviously those that don't have a private driveway to charge their car in are subject to paying more for using basically the same service, which obviously is a equity point of contention, and we've called for it to be matched with the VAT rate from domestic energy. This is kind of a blocker to those that don't have anywhere to charge their car, or that would be using public charging, particularly in busier cities and where you don't have a private driveway. It's definitely something to be considered, but I think it's not the only issue with the public charging infrastructure at the moment. As the rate of electric vehicles has increased in recent years, we've kind of outpaced what the government thought the government thought we would be. There's a lot more EVs on the road than we predicted, which means there's a lot more EVs to each public charger. So we need to increase the public charging infrastructure. And the government set quite an ambitious target of 300,000 chargers by, I think, 2030. So they really need to rapidly roll that out to ensure that people have access to charging. But of course, it shouldn't be kind of a postcode lottery, and depending on whether you live in a block of flats or a house with a big front garden, whether you pay more for your charging or not. So it's definitely an equity point that the government need to match.
Thanks, Sophie. We're just going to wrap up in a minute. I think we've got time for one last question. Stuart, I'll come to you, but other panelists, if you have thoughts, please do jump in after Stuart. Two questions I'm kind of going to wrap up into one on aviation taxes. So someone's put in the chat about understanding the rationale of frequent flyer levy versus air passenger duty. And the question is, if the aim is to be progressive, why not use the tax and welfare system based directly on income rather than the blunt targeting of multiple flights? Tagged onto the back of that, I'd love to just put James's comment/question in about the case for a tax on private jets. So Stuart, over to you, and then anyone else that's got input, please do jump in.
Yeah, so the rationale for a frequent flyer levy versus air passenger duty, to start with, is reflective of the fact that air passenger duty in its current form is based solely on the distance travelled, not the frequency or number of flights that any one person takes in a given time period, whereas the frequent flyer levy would potentially also be focused on the distance travelled, but it would also incorporate the number of flights that an individual has taken in that period. The part of the question is around whether it's just simpler to base it on income, and a frequent flyer levy to an extent would be based on income, I think. Not directly, but as Sophie set out in her presentation earlier on, actually, those who are on higher incomes do tend to travel by plane more often than those on lower incomes. So I think that's the rationale for the frequent flyer levy and the APD. On a tax on private jets, I certainly think there should be. Do I want to offer a strong opinion here or not? I'm wondering what trap I'm making for myself. I certainly think there are strong arguments in favour of taxing the use of private jets. I'll phrase it that way for now.
It's very diplomatic of you, Stuart. Does anyone else on the panel want to jump in for that question, or any kind of final thoughts or closing remarks? Zoe?
Yeah, just on air passenger duty and frequent flyer levy, I suppose the answer might be something to do with the high carbon impact on flying, and also it's a sector that's very, very hard to decarbonize and might continue to be high carbon for a long time. If we were to price a flight with an air passenger duty relative to its social cost of the carbon emissions, it would probably be really, really, really expensive, and that would mean that it would only be available to people on a high income. Flying would only be available to people on a high income. Whereas if you did a frequent flyer levy, it's slightly more of a system where everyone is entitled to fly a bit, and if you want to fly a lot more, you pay an increasing amount, and I think it's a better way of targeting sort of very frequent flying behaviour that is that we see from high income households.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm sure we could have another entire discussion about frequent flyer levies and other aviation taxes as well. But there will be lots of discussion about that in the next reports that we're publishing. But in the meantime, please do check out the first part of this report that's been published today. You can find it on our website. There are links on Twitter and in this event invitation as well. Big thank you to all our panelists, my colleagues and James today for a brilliant discussion. And thank you everybody for joining, for the good questions in the Q&A. Have a lovely afternoon and stay tuned for the follow-up and more exciting, if I'm allowed to say that, part of this report coming very soon in a few weeks. Thanks very much. Bye.